Sorry for the gap in videos there. I went and eat some pizza for a very late lunch, early dinner. You ever wonder why we have brunch but we don't have like supper instead of supper or dinner? Like, why is brunch a thing but not like a mid-afternoon type meal? Anyways, next part of the chapter goes through how cash distributions can affect firm value, now that we know the two basic ways that cash distributions can occur in a firm. So this is a little intro to it, and then there's 3 theories associated with it, and then there's 3 more theories that are more maybe practical, that are not just related to like firm value, but more to what investors perceive when a company decides to do cash distributions. All right, so we know the value of operations, the intrinsic value of operations. If you're not tired of seeing this thing yet, right, it's basically determined by the present value of the future cash flows, the future free cash flows of the firm. And that if I can change the future cash flows, or if I can change the firm's WACC, then I can change the firm's value. Right? And in any decision that management makes that either affects free cash flows or WACC will ultimately affect firm value. And so, every decision is made within that framework. And so then the question becomes, well, we already looked at capital structure and kind of came to the conclusion that yes, capital structure does matter. Right? And it can affect firm value, both by affecting free cash flows and affecting WACC. So then there's the question, well, does the distribution policy matter? Can I change the firm's distribution policy in such a way that it changes the value of the firm? Right? Because I shouldn't really care. Like, as a manager, I don't care how I distribute it. I just want to distribute those cash amounts in a way that will help the firm the most by maximizing its value. So the optimal distribution policy is defined as the distribution policy that maximizes the value of the firm by choosing, it says, the optimal level, so the amount basically, and the form. And when we say form, we mean, do you want to distribute these funds as dividends, or do you want to distribute these funds as capital gains? Now, there's another thing to point out that isn't like explicitly in the notes, but it's something that you should remember from your previous classes. This is how we define the expected return on a stock. D1, the dividend expected at time 1 divided by the price plus the growth rate, correct? Where this guy is my dividend yield and this guy is my capital gain yield. And it comes to this idea that as the investor, I can earn a return in 2 ways from a stock. I can earn some of it from the dividend yield and some of it from the capital gain yield. Now, if a firm doesn't pay dividends, guess what? Dividend yield is 0. And I can't have a lot of both, right? Firms are going to either have a high dividend yield and a low capital gain yield, which I'll abbreviate CGY, or they're going to have a low dividend yield and a high capital gain yield. Why? Because there's 2 things I can do with net income. You can see how much I love this graphic. I can pay dividends. That's going to give me a high dividend yield. Or alternatively, I can keep it as retained earnings, with the idea being that the firm keeps the retained earnings to do what? To grow. And that by growing, the stock price should go up, which results in a high capital gain yield. All right, I can't have a lot of both. Now, yes, can you have both? Sure. There are lots of firms that pay dividends and still have increases in their stock price, of course. May I only have one? Of course. Like I said, if a firm doesn't pay dividends, Netflix, you're not going to have a dividend yield from Netflix. You can go check Yahoo Finance right now. I promise you the dividend yield says 0. Or in A, because they don't even pay one. Yeah. So we can have one, we can have both. We can't have a lot of both, right? It's a trade-off. Now, we generally associate paying out dividends, of course, high dividend yield, right? High capital gain yield is also associated with repurchases. Because think about it. You're not forced to sell your stock to the company whenever they repurchase stock, right? So they have to offer you a competitive price. And you're probably going to only sell the stock if you're going to have a capital gain, right? So repurchases provide a return to shareholders as a capital gain, whereas paying dividends provides a return to shareholders as the dividend yield. So make sure you kind of have that kind of aligned in your head, right? The repurchases are going to lead to capital gains. Paying dividends leads to a dividend yield. Again, I typically can't have a lot of both. I can have some of both. I can have a lot of one and a little of the other. I can have a lot of one and none of the other, or all of one, I should say, none of the other. Just depends on the firm. Now, some definitions to take care of before we go any further. The difference between the total distribution ratio versus the target distribution ratio. I can't read after pizza, I guess. Versus the target payout ratio. They're both a percentage of net income. So to find both of these, the distribution and the payout, net income goes on the bottom of the fraction. The only difference is what goes on the top. Distribution ratio, it says the percentage of net income distributed to shareholders through cash dividends or stock repurchases. So it's the entire amount we're distributing. Whereas the payout ratio, it is just the cash dividends. And so that means that my distribution ratio is always greater or equal to my payout, right? So if I only pay out cash distributions as dividends, then those two will be equal. If I do some as repurchases and some as dividends, the distribution ratio should always be higher than the payout ratio. We don't really define a repurchase ratio. It's just nothing that we need for practical purposes. But we do know that there's different combinations a firm could have of these two ratios, and depending on those combinations tells us what a firm is doing actually. So if they would have a high distribution ratio and a high payout ratio, that means that they're mostly doing actual dividends. So they're going to have high dividends. They're going to have low or zero repurchases, which I'll just abbreviate REP there. And as a result, how are shareholders going to get most of their return? They're going to get it as a dividend yield, right? That's how they're going to earn money from the stock, as a dividend yield. Second kind of combination here is we could have a high distribution and a small payout. So if we're not paying it out as dividends, but we're still distributing a lot, that means I have a high amount of repurchases. And I have low or no dividends. And there, most of my return should come as a capital gain yield. If I have a low distribution ratio and a low payout ratio, they're both low. I'm not giving people anything. So here I'm going to have low dividends and low repurchases. Means I'm basically keeping it all. Right? I'm hoarding the money. Why? Probably because I'm growing really quickly. And if you go by something like pecking order theory, what does it say to use first? Retained earnings. They're probably keeping their retained earnings to help them grow. And also in that case, most of the return should come as capital gain yield. So make sure you can kind of think through those different scenarios. That could easily be, I don't know if I put that in the review questions or not, but that could easily be a good little drop down box question of, how are you going to get your return if it's a high distribution, high payout, if it's a high distribution, low payout, or if it's a low distribution, low payout. Notice we don't have a fourth one here because you cannot have a low distribution and a high payout. That just doesn't make sense because the distribution always has to be higher than the payout. So that's why we don't have a fourth scenario. But what we do have coming next is 3 theories: dividend irrelevance, dividend preference, and tax effect, which is basically a capital gain preference, right? So we basically are going to have 3 conflicting theories, where one is going to say dividends don't matter. One is going to say dividends are preferred, and one is going to say capital gains are preferred. And then we're just going to shrug our shoulders and look at what the evidence actually says. So that's what's coming next.